as I said, so what I would try to do is just to go through some statistics, offer you some conclusions and some potential explanations, but I just want to stress that they are potential. It's not that they fully explain as what's going on, so further research is needed. So what I want to talk about today is to start off with Latvians in England and just talk a little bit about numbers, but also is how you define Latvians and kind of in England. Then, so my focus will be on educational achievement, so it's definition of Latvian children as well, as who are these Latvian children in England. Then I will look at geographical distribution, their academic achievement, and then, as I said, some potential factors associated with the underachievement. If we look at any sort of statistical data or that would look at numbers, as any data in migration, it's very difficult because you have so many different things going on. And within the EU, actually things are even more complicated because nobody really counts who is getting in and out, as those borders are quite open. So no robust data. If you look at different data sources as like census or some other sources, there is also a mix as how do you count in sense of what geographical area you cover. So some people look at England, then census looks at England and Wales combined. Then you have UK, then sometimes it's actually England, Wales, Scotland, but not Northern Ireland, so it's quite a mess. And another really big issue is how do you define Latvians? Within Latvia, it's kind of, it is an issue as well, but then it's more like ethnically based. But when Latvians are outside Latvia, usually it would be linked to 3 categories, but then they are interlinked as well. So somebody who is born in Latvia and then comes to England, you can call them as Latvians. Somebody who is a Latvian citizen, that's kind of would be Latvian national. But then it gets slightly more complicated. So what if it's second generation, somebody who is born here, can we still count them as Latvian? So those who speak Latvian at home, there will be another definition. So these are just kind of problems as to get to any number, as how many Latvians are there. If you look at numbers available, so Latvian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then I'm really not sure where their numbers come from. I looked everywhere, there is no source mentioned. But they say this is so around 100,000 Latvian nationals in the UK. Nationals because you have the whole issue with citizens, non-citizens, so Latvian nationals. So somebody who belongs, not going into identity issues, belongs to Latvian state, so citizen or non-citizen. So that's one thing. The Office of Citizenship and Migration Affairs, and this is where people are encouraged, it's not compulsory, or at least you cannot really control it. People who specify their place of residency. So when you go, let's say if you travel to Latvia, then you have to exchange your passport, which expires. They sometimes will ask you, okay, where do you live now? If you live in England, then you sign like a letter saying this is my address. So this is that statistics. It relies on people actually saying that they live here. And that's England. So it's around 50,000 Latvian nationals as of July 2015. Statistics from the embassy, every year there are slightly more than 2,000 children registered as Latvian citizens. Again, some of them will go back to Latvia, some of them will stay. So it's getting kind of closer to as how many children are out there. So this is kind of from the Latvian side. What I did a little bit of research from the British or English side. The only thing really you can rely on is census. That's relatively old, but again, it gives you a little bit, some estimates, and then I will mention some, like 2 other sources. So if we look at the census and look at different categories, so you have around 30,000 who chose Latvian as their first language. So that's quite a big number. But then because of the obviously Russian speakers from Latvia, you have slightly less than 55,000 who identified Latvia as their birthplace. And it's actually quite interesting that 90% from those who were born in Latvia came to England and Wales after 2004, but that's kind of the EU thing. And it's also interesting that only in 2011, 9,000 came to England and Wales from Latvia. They're just in 1 year. So that census, as I said, it's relatively old. What other data is out there? There used to be a workers' registration scheme, specifically for the countries who joined in 2004. It worked only until June 2011. In that time period, you can see overall slightly less than 80,000 Latvian nationals registered with the scheme. Again, some of them stayed, some of them went back, some of them go back and forth. And you can see, the migration seems to be related to economic situation in Latvia. You can see that it slightly increases between 2004 and 2005, so everything opens, people come. Then when Latvia actually had kind of better economic situation, the numbers went slightly down, but then starting from 2008, the economic crisis, they just shoot straight up. And it doesn't matter whether you look at workers' registration scheme or there is another database which is national insurance number. So you have to register with that in order to, definitely in order to work, but also if you want to receive any sort of benefits, etc. So you register with the system. If you look at that, and that's kind of running throughout, so I go to the data until June 2015. Up to that date, it's 160,000 Latvian nationals registered. Again, the same problem. Some of them went back and some of them stayed, but it's like if you register, you have to register, but you don't have to unregister when you go back or change your status. And saying that, these numbers actually still underestimate registrations because often, especially the workers' registration scheme, not everybody registered, and then when you were self-employed, there were different aspects, whether you had to register, how to register, etc. And it's also all the dependents. With the workers' registration scheme, you didn't have to register. So unless you work, you do not register. With national insurance, you have higher numbers because even if you're self-employed, you need national insurance. So it's maybe slightly underestimated with some dependents. So people who are not in the market. As I said, I wanted to do this just because nobody has done it before, and different numbers kept appearing everywhere. But it's also, my main really focus was on children. I work in education here, and I look at different databases. And then around a year ago, the research report came out looking at comparison of academic achievements between children where English is their first language and children where English is their additional language. And they looked at different language groups, and then suddenly Latvians appeared as underachieving. And I just wanted to dig deeper and then see what's going on. So the database I was using, it's National Pupil Database, and it's not a sample, it's annual school census which contains detailed information about pupils in school and colleges in England. It's all pupils in England. If you are in the school, you are on that database. So no sampling, nothing. It's administrative database. So what they have is pupils with English as additional language. You can identify those. And then starting from 2008, they also have reported home language. So it's not only EL, but it's what language they speak at home. There's some problems with the database, as always, with statistics, because it wasn't designed really for research. It's more like for monitoring purposes, just around generic academic achievements rather than looking at different groups. So EL identifies, so it's whether English is your first or additional language. It is reported by parents. In some cases, schools, if they know situation, then they some of them will feel it, like teachers will say, okay, that their child comes from that particular family, so probably that language. But in most cases, it's when your child starts reception, so you have like a survey, a questionnaire to fill in about different aspects, so language is one. If you look at specifically, if you want to look at Latvian children, so Russian or other language speakers from Latvia are not included in the sample I looked at, just because it's Latvian. Because it's not a combination of country of their birth, and language. So I wasn't able to include Russian speakers from Latvia, Russian speaking children from Latvia, or any other language speakers from Latvia. So another problem is that in mixed families who are here, many of them would put English, if it's mixed English, and then say Latvian English. And Russian, they might put English as first language, so I couldn't look at those. The database and that status does not specify the knowledge of English as well, but then from September 2016 it will be included. They do it in Wales already for, I think, Welsh speakers and kind of other language speakers, so they are introducing the same system in England, but I couldn't use it. So this is kind of context for that. So now if you look at Latvian, and by Latvian I mean children from families where parents identified Latvian as their home language. So growth overall from 2004 up to 2015, and it probably continues growing, the number of EL, so English as an additional language pupils, is growing. It was around 12% from the overall population in schools, and now it's 17%. In some London schools, there is 98% of EL children, in like Tower Hamlets, in I think in some areas of East London, kind of further East London as well. And that's kind of geographically specific, like different groups and proportions, etc.
So this is in England, yeah?
Yeah, this is England. Yeah, this is just the database is just England. Yeah. So then what I did, I looked specifically at Latvian, or Latvian as home language. In 2004, there were only 378 pupils with Latvian as home language in England, and it's a very minor percent from the all EL pupils. And then in 2015, so its last academic year, it was 7,388. I mean, it is an impressive growth, and this is the number. It is a big number. So it's interesting to look at what's going on with those children. So this is the kind of overall growth year by year, and it just grows up to again 2008. The growth wasn't that pronounced, and then starting from 2008, it just goes up. There are fewer in secondary schools, and there are more in primary schools. It's the difference between primary and secondary. So when people and parents have to identify EL status, they have to redo it when they apply for secondary schools. Many of them will drop EL status if a child was in the system for the whole primary school. They will just put English. That's why you also have, there might be even more, so the overall number may be that. Just because definitely in secondary schools it's underestimated. So these are the numbers. And this is just split. So the biggest number is the ones who are 6 years and 7 years old, again, in kind of primary school. Geographical distribution, so East Midlands, east of England, and Yorkshire and Cumberland. So those kind of areas. This is just a map to show, and Peterborough, Lincolnshire, that's the highest. So these are numbers of children. I guess they should be relatively close to adults as Latvians as well, but you never know because migration is related to family circumstances, what jobs people do, etc. But overall, it should kind of reflect that. And as I mentioned, so if you look at the top, so Lincolnshire, Northamptonshire, Peterborough, Kent, Kingston upon Hull, and Lancashire, they have the biggest proportion, so it's local authorities. So the achievement, I looked at early years, and let's say if you take reading, out of those who have English as their first language, 76% achieve at least expected level of development. And then 66%, that's for overall EL, English as an additional language. 43% of the ones with Latvian as home language achieve the expected level. So the difference, it's quite big. Math the difference is slight, actually, no, it's actually, yeah. The same, so overall, again, the same story. Key stage 1, which is age 7. Reading, you get there, so it's better. Writing and math is actually quite good. But then another dip is key stage 2 and key stage 3. Where, so with reading, 80% of English with the first language achieve the kind of expected level, a good level. 46% of Latvian with home language. Math, 76, 64, so the gap is slightly closer. If you look at GCSEs, the difference is quite drastic. So if you look overall, 61% achieve 5+ A star to C GCSEs, including English and Math, which is kind of standard, and only 30% of where Latvian is a home language. So, as I said, usually you would expect, so for the new arrivals, when they come into like reception or primary school, so the overall levels of achievement they should catch up by the end of primary school pretty much. And EL children overall do, but Latvians are still lagging behind. So it's kind of not happening. Math is better than English, but again, this is from kind of overall research. This is usually the case. So potential factors that explain underachievement. You can look at levels, obviously. Language is the first one, both of parents and children. Knowledge of the system. The British or English educational system is quite elaborate in the sense which school your child goes to and how you do it, and then kind of the whole primary, secondary. So it's just to know the system and how it works. International arrival during the key stage. 80% of Latvian pupils who were in the secondary school in 2015 arrived after key stage 2. So they arrived into secondary school rather than they were here in primary school. You look at pupil mobility, migrants are more mobile within the country. Obviously family background, parental qualifications, etc., quality of schools, and neighborhood deprivation. And I just want to show some. So if we talk about quality of schools, Latvian children tend to go to slightly worse schools as measured by Ofsted inspection results. So they have a higher kind of proportion of not so good satisfactory schools. They also go to more diverse schools and to where they have a higher proportion of both ethnic minorities or linguistic minorities, but they're also disadvantaged children. So that's talking about schools. One last slide. So, and then the last thing, what I did talking about neighborhood deprivation and looking at these concentration pockets of Latvians. So I looked at employment, poverty, migration, different characteristics of areas where you have a high proportion of Latvian children. And the one, employment-wise, actually, because most of them do work, those areas, with some exceptions, are actually the unemployment rate is lower than the average in England. Migration, entry university, so they're quite diverse. But one thing stands out is the proportion of the under 16 who live in relative poverty, and across all areas where you have a high density of Latvian children, they are all above the average in England. So which means those families do work, but they work in low-paid jobs, so their income is quite low.
And I would argue that it's really can be a mistake, because Lithuanian immigration rate is among the highest in the European Union, and since independence we lost 1/3 of our population to migration. So it can be some exercise to imagine, for example, UK losing its 1/3 of population, and what is left then, all the most active and young people will live such a country. So my argument is that Lithuanian diaspora has a huge potential to contribute for the sustainable development of the home country. To have some image about an immigration situation, you can see that it has some ups and downs, and the first one is more related, similarly like in Latvia, with joining the European Union. The second one is more related with obligation to pay the social security taxes, and due to this obligation, a lot of people finally registered that they are not living in Lithuania anymore. So it's not the actual job, but it's our Department of Statistics just received this data like this. And definition in my presentation of Lithuanian diaspora is taken from Global Lithuanian Program, and it includes citizens of the Republic of Lithuania, Lithuanian descent, and non-Lithuanian descents originated themselves from Lithuania and connecting themselves with Lithuania's historical, cultural, social, economic, and political ties. Here we have in mind a huge Jewish community abroad, and some other ethnic minorities as well. And this definition actually echoes the proposed definition of diaspora by Gamlen, by International Organization for Migration, and some other more progressive definitions. Why I'm trying to talk more about diaspora of professionals. Actually, both qualified and not qualified diaspora members contribute to home country well-being. However, this contribution is different, and contribution of less qualified is more related with financial remittances, while contribution of more qualified is related more with facilitation of trade, investments, transfer of knowledge and technologies. And to look at the possible forms of diaspora professionals' contribution, they can be described by using, for example, Bourdieu theory on capital exchange, and can be separated in economic, cultural, social, symbolic, as well as political contribution. And actually only one financial remittances can be quantified. And from the World Bank sources, we can see that in Lithuania, financial remittances just have been growing from 2000 and now reached quite impressive sum for Lithuania. However, recent authors declare that actually remittances, financial remittances, they contribute not so much for country development, home country development, as usually they are used not to start new business or to make some other improvements, but just they are used in daily life. And actually other kinds of contribution can be more important for the impact to some institutional reforms for home country development. And also we can see that even if there is some resources of diaspora members, they do not count if these members do not have motivation to use them. And this motivation can be intrinsic, according to Kuznetsov, as desire to be a part of a larger national project, or external, some strong motivation to advance professionally and economically. And the data that I'm using is from a research project on the use of Lithuanian diaspora of professional network potential. And we made a survey which was conducted in 2014 with 512 respondents from many countries of the world of Lithuanian diaspora professionals, and as well as in-depth interviews with diaspora professionals. First, what we wanted to look for these ties of diaspora professionals and home country. And obviously the strongest ties are with relatives, with family members. However, there is a strong correlation between keeping contacts with closest relatives and also institutions of Lithuania. And people who have born in Lithuania, associate themselves with Lithuania, and lives abroad less time, tend to keep more infrequent contacts with institutions and other organizations. And here, I want to look at on the types of and involvement of cooperation. We can see that not a high percentage actually involved in this contribution, but the only high percentage is with spreading positive news about Lithuania, and not so much working with companies, finding partners abroad, or similar things. But here what is interesting, that a lot of people just said that even they are not involved, they would consider it to given an opportunity. It's a huge potential, just to find some measures to involve them and to propose something, how we can contribute. The similar thing we can see in this figure, that actually there is a big potential also to be involved via these forms of cooperation as well. And motivation of diaspora to cooperate. We found that actually diaspora professionals who keep strong contacts with persons and institutions, they declared their motivation as willingness to do something good for Lithuania, even if they wouldn't personally benefit from that, and have high motivation to use their potential for creating well-being. Actually, also big motivation is based on self-realization, possibility to help friends, or to help in creation of Lithuania in general. And actually, obligation to add to well-being of Lithuania is stronger for people with higher education. For example, PhD people, for sure, they would have this moral imperative to add something for well-being. And motivation based on good time spending, interesting activity, and work with interesting people is more common among younger Lithuanian diaspora members. This means that must be differently oriented measures to involve them in development, for sure. And the last question was about cooperation barriers. First and more frequently answer to this was the lack of information how diaspora can contribute to well-being of Lithuania. Second one was corruption, and in this case it was interesting that this answer was more frequent among people who have no any ties with Lithuanian organizations or institutions. And diaspora professionals who have these ties, actually they said instead of corruption, more bigger barriers, legal impediments. And it means that some stereotypes also place in this side. And also it was an answer of insufficient attention to diaspora from Lithuanian government, and quite reflexive that lack of initiative to cooperate in foreign Lithuanian communities as well. And what is important also is that nowadays government measures are more related with best practices of other countries. First of all, with Global Scout, and as a network of business contacts, and as you see, some other practices in other countries. And on this basis, we can also find very, very good and very well working networks for Lithuania, for example. And it would be nice to mention a City of London club here, formed by Lithuanian professionals, and also Rotary Club in Chicago Lithuanians, and Global Lithuanian Leaders. And they have huge programs how to involve different groups of Lithuanian diaspora professionals in development of a country. And for this, actually, we had some recommended forms of cooperation. First of all, not so much centralized measures for involvement of diaspora professionals, but to support already going initiatives and to support the voluntary work in the creation of welfare Lithuania. And not to make something artificially, but as I said, promote really existing networks. And as well, the cooperation in the field of information that actually nowadays again receive more attention, and already a few years we have a nice website on global Lithuanians, and also new initiative in immigration organization to have especially for diaspora-oriented website.
Walking into this building earlier this afternoon, I had a sense of déjà vu, and I realised that the last time I was in this building was when I sat my BA finals at the University of London exactly 50 years ago. So that's a little bit of personal archaeology for you, but I just thought I would share that little anecdote with you. Yeah, this is a joint presentation, and I want to absolutely stress three co-authors and their fundamental contribution to this paper, because they did most of the interviews. And my role has essentially been to try to coordinate this comparative study, because I think that comparing countries' experience of migration is really interesting and really fruitful. And of course, the three Baltic states make a unique trio for this comparison. I'm also kind of badging or branding this presentation as a kind of pilot study for a larger project called Youth Mobility, which is, I think as Dace just said, a Horizon 2020 project, which has only been going for a year or so. We're in the data collection stage, and Latvia is one of our partner countries, along with many other countries within the European Union. And essentially it studies the interaction between spatial mobility, international mobility in the form of intra-EU migration, and social mobility and youth transitions from education to employment, from one kind of employment to another, from youth to, if you like, full adulthood, and so on. So that's just a little bit of the background to this particular paper and the way in which it relates to a much larger project. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to concentrate, of course, mainly on findings, but before that, a series of kind of preliminary contextual slides about the context which I've just described. I want to specify what the specific research questions are. A few words about some of the conceptual frameworks that we're trying to bring to bear on this empirical data. A few more background statistics in addition to the ones that we've heard already on the Baltic countries' experience of migration and also economic trends. Research design and methods, just one slide, and then I'll work through the findings, which will be a series of slides kind of nominating key points with some selected quotes, typical quotes from the interview narratives. So the context is this general rise that we observe, and also statistically through Eurostat data and other sources, of young adult graduate migration within Europe, and the increasingly dominant role of London as a key destination for this intra-European mobility. We can trace the origins perhaps back to the 1990s in terms of the movement of considerable numbers of French and German and Italian graduates, and from other sort of old EU countries, the EU 15 countries. But then, of course, when the Eastern enlargement came in 2004 and 2007, then the Eastern flow also became extremely important, and that was exacerbated, as it was from other parts of peripheral Europe, like Ireland and Southern Europe, with the 2008 crisis. But within this kind of changing map of intra-European migration and the increasing role of graduate level migrants within this overall total, it seemed to us that the role of the 3 Baltic states tends to be overlooked. You know, there's a lot of studies which you can read in the migration literature about young Italians and young Spanish people, for example, and Greeks and Irish and Poles in the UK and other kind of core EU countries, but the Baltic states tend to be, I think, overlooked. These are our 3 key research questions, each of which kind of correspond to a stage in the migration process. So what are the main motivations of young graduates from these 3 countries to migrate to London? How do they describe and narrate their working lives in London, both their working lives and their non-working lives? And finally, what are the perspectives for the future? Do they intend to stay abroad, return home, or engage in some other kind of maybe onward migration? Okay, I could spend quite a lot of time talking about our conceptual frameworks, because this has been kind of one of my main kind of contributions to this project. I mean, both this project and also the wider Y Mobility project. But I'll try and be sort of as brief and synthetic as possible. So firstly, it's about youth transitions. We are interested in people who are young adults between the age of finishing education, which can be sort of 16 or 18 upwards, up until something like mid-30s, let's say. So that's the broad age range. And the kinds of transitions that those people are involved in are, of course, the education to employment transition, which may be a complex transition. I'm very much simplifying what these transitions are. The transition from unemployment in the home country to employment abroad, or the transition from one kind of employment in the home country, casual, precarious, low paid, to another kind of employment abroad, which is more secure and better paid. And all those transitions can be embedded in a wider life transition, which we can call the transition from youth to some notion of full adulthood. By full adulthood, we usually mean something like, you know, settling down, developing life with a partner, planning a family, establishing a home, and so on. In terms of, let's say, economic geography, we mobilise this Coreperipheral Model, which is an old model in political economy and development studies, but I think it can be applied to Europe, because if you go back, let's say, to the 1950s and 1960s and look at a map of the migration flows in those days, it was very much migration from the peripheral countries of Europe, particularly the southern periphery, to the core countries. And we see that map continuing to replay itself in the current migration, the current spatial migration patterns as well. And of course, underlying that simple spatial pattern are all sorts of political, economic processes about the nature of capitalist development and so on. Thirdly, we are interested also in looking at these migration flows in kind of combined class and labour market terms. So are these Baltic migrants what Adrian Favell would call Eurostars, kind of high-flying, multilingual, multicultural, high-earning people working in major European countries, for example? Or are they what Conradson and Layson would call more like ordinary and middling transnationalists, which are more like a sort of standard middle class level, let's say? Or are they more like working labour migrants suffering, even though they're graduates, from de-skilling and forced only to access low status jobs because of the language barrier, or because they can't trade on the qualifications because their qualifications are not recognised or whatever? And the final conceptual framework that we try to bring in is the notion of lifestyle migration, which traditionally in migration studies has been applied to people who are migrating into rural areas and kind of opting out of the rat race and looking for a quieter lifestyle. But I think that can also be applied to this younger group who are migrating to large urban areas, to the large metropolitan area of London, which can also be seen as a search for a particular lifestyle, a metropolitan or cosmopolitan lifestyle, if you will. Okay, here's a few background statistics which simply reinforce those that we have seen before. The top set look at total and youth unemployment and show really neatly how these three countries went through the crisis and have partially recovered from the crisis, at least in terms of crude unemployment and youth unemployment figures. And then I just picked out the national insurance registrations, the NINO registrations for the 3 countries. And my data are not quite so up to date as yours are. I'm a year behind you, but you can see that for Latvia it was 150,000 at that stage. And what Olga said about the fact that the NINO registrations are a very imperfect measure of the chronology of migration has to be repeated here as well. Okay, our basic research method is the personal narrative extensive interview, the open-ended, largely open-ended, loosely structured interview. And my 3 colleagues, Maria Saar interviewed Estonians, Aya Lule from Latvia interviewed the Latvians, and Violetta Perutis, who I was hoping would be here today, but her husband has been taken ill, so unfortunately she's not. Violetta looked at the Lithuanians. For the time being, we're treating these 3 countries as one sample. We haven't yet had time to explore what differences there are, if any, between the 3 samples. So, what I now move into is the findings part of this presentation, which are organised under each of the 3 research questions. And for each of the research questions, I'll try to sort of pick out the key narrative themes that we distilled from the interviews, and then a bunch of quotes to illustrate each of the, or some of the themes. So research question 1 was about motives, and of course no great surprises here, as you would expect. The economic motive was paramount. It was all about increasing income earning capacity, but also career development as well. And we can see London, and we also see this in terms of the internal migration dynamics within the UK as well. London is seen as what my colleague Tony Fielding at Sussex calls an escalator region. It's where you go when you want to escalate or accelerate your career because of the tremendous opportunities there are in the labour market because of the higher incomes, the greater possibilities for promotion, and so on. And whether you stay on the escalator and stay in London, or whether you step off the escalator and go somewhere else, of course, is the big question for the future. So economics, career development, and also self-realisation. We found that there was a strong narrative theme which was about this notion of going to the UK, and particularly going to London, as the place where one could really test one's limits and realise one's potential. Also, the lifestyle factor came in as well as a key motivation, in some cases even overriding the economic motivation, but in most cases alongside the economic motivation. And then, of course, as there always is in migration, there are certain personal factors. People feel the need to escape their country, there's some kind of rupture, people fall in love and follow their partners and so on, so these personal factors are important as well. So here's just some quotes. I'm not going to read all the quotes out because that's really boring for you, so I think that you can probably scan these quotes as I just kind of burble on quietly, trying to pick out maybe some of the key phrases. So if you look at the first 2 quotes there's the mention of money. So it's all about a higher income, higher wages coming through. The third quote, actually, as I walked in just at the end of the previous section, there was a former journalist sitting here who was talking about the limited scope for journalistic development and journalistic careers in the Baltic states. And actually here's a classic illustration of precisely that point, where Nika describes how she was working for a Russian language newspaper in Riga, but she says, the ceiling is just too low in Latvia. It's such a small country and so few newspapers. So in order to develop her journalistic career, she had to move away. And then some of the personal factors in terms of research. Question 1, this is more about self-realization. So if you look at the middle quote there from the Estonian respondent, taking different jobs and challenges is like conquering a new universe. So, and then once I knew it, it was a good feeling, the feeling that you know everything about it and then you want to move on, explore something new again. So these personal and self-realization factors come out as important as well. Research question 2 was more about the experience of living and working in London, and the key themes that we extracted here were, of course, about the working environment, because these were primarily economically motivated young graduates, and the contrast between the work culture in London, here in London, compared to the home country. The fact that there was more possibility for transparency and openness and a sort of critical engagement with each other in the work environment. Key themes here, as I said, are more open, meritocratic, less hierarchical, and the possibility to develop managerial and entrepreneurial skills to a better degree than would be the case back home, and also, of course, the chance to learn English as well. Many interviews also talked about the cultural aspects of living in London, both the high culture and the kind of everyday multiculture of London as such a cosmopolitan and super diverse city. And this was compared and contrasted with some aspects of the boring, sometimes racist and homophobic society back home. But there was a sort of counter-narrative which came in here, which was, for some people, this contrast between London's excessive cosmopolitanism, if you like, on the one hand, and the yearning for the peace and quiet and nature of the home country, particularly maybe at a slightly later stage of these young adults' lives, when they were transiting to the later stage of young adulthood. So here are some quotes which illustrate the points that I just made. So the middle one: what Latvia lacks is pleasant communication, discussion, constructive communication, sharing opinions of ideas. If you critique somebody, then that's seen as a problem. And then, as time is short, I'll just let you read that set of quotes, and this set also about other aspects of life. And here we're sort of getting to the yearning to return, and the third research question, which is about the future. After a certain number of years in London, people realise that actually at a later stage in life, when you might want to sort of settle down, then maybe the home country offers a better environment for bringing up children than living in London, because it's so cloudy, so crowded, so expensive. There's critiques about the school system which resonate with one of the previous papers, and so on. So here we're coming into the final research question, the future, where migrants were target migrants. In other words, they came abroad in order to save up to buy a flat, or they came abroad to get a PhD or some particular qualification. Then, of course, the return is kind of preordained or prefigured to some extent. But actually, most of the interviewees had a very open-ended agenda and were extremely ambiguous and ambivalent about what their future migration intentions will be. And this is a general problem with interviewing and talking to people at that young age, and we also find this with parallel interviews that I have done with Italians and Spanish in the UK as well. So there is some ambivalence about the future. They see that the career development and professional fulfillment is obviously best achieved in London, but if one thinks to the future of settling down and raising, that's two, yeah, thanks, raising a family, then clearly the better quality of at least the physical environment of home is maybe preferred. So here we have some illustrations of that dilemma of trying to trade off economic prospects on the one hand and career, and the future of sort of more mature adulthood on the other. So just some conclusions there. I think what we have found, if this is not being too kind of optimistic or arrogant, is that our findings do match quite well with some of the theoretical concepts that I presented to you very briefly. There are these core periphery structures in Europe which seem to very much structure people's migration behavior and thoughts about the future. They do achieve considerable, in most cases, upward socioeconomic mobility through migration. And there is also a lifestyle story here as well. Young people, young graduates are keen to explore the lifestyle that is on offer in London. And for some that constitutes a permanent attraction, and for others it constitutes an attraction which just lasts for a number of years, and then another kind of lifestyle reasserts itself when they think about the next stage of their lives. I said at the beginning that we were treating this as a single sample. We haven't yet had chance to explore the comparative aspect, but overall there is much more similarity than differences between the three groups of interviewees. If we have any kind of intuition, it is that perhaps the Estonians seem a bit more return orientated than the other two groups. That may have to do with the somewhat stronger socioeconomic context of that country compared to Latvia and Lithuania. We also feel that there's some gender contrasts which need investigating. On the whole, we saw that the more career-orientated males were more orientated towards staying in London, whereas the females perhaps were a bit more family-orientated. I mean, both are developing their own families, but also feeling responsible for caring for their elderly, perhaps their elderly parents back home. But that's maybe too simplistic a gender divide. And the final thing, which I think we would like to investigate, are issues of identity. How are these migrations shaping ongoing identities, as Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, or developing feelings of becoming British, or more European, or indeed cosmopolitan.